Today on Ask BRStv, we're answering Robert Collins' questions from YouTube. What are your thoughts on mixing Red Sea Coral Pro and Blue Bucket Salt Mix? Hey guys, Randy here answering your Ask BRStv questions, and this one comes straight from our reefing community friends on YouTube, where Robert Collins asked if there were any drawbacks to 50-50 mix of Red Sea Coral Pro and Red Sea Blue Bucket Salt Mix. The short answer, Robert, is that if your target range for major elements falls between the two salt mixes, there's nothing wrong with mixing them together for that purpose, but here's some other points to consider as well. As most reefers have come to know, the levels for alkalinity, calcium, and magnesium in the two Red Sea salt mixes are relatively different and provide reefers a couple of options based on their personal desires for those levels, or clear instructions on which one to use for those following Red Sea's reef care recipes. But what if your goal is somewhere in between those two ranges? So for some reefers, the elevated levels in the Coral Pro salt, which typically average out to an alkalinity of around 12 DKH, 465 calcium, and 1390 magnesium, can be on the higher end of what they want for their tanks, while the lower parameters of the Blue Bucket salt mix, usually averaging out to 8 DKH, 430 calcium, and 1280 for mag, could alternatively be lower than their goal. But what can you do to find a happy medium in this somewhat rare occasion? Well, most commonly, reefers who need to adjust their water parameters prior to using new saltwater for water changes will correct them by using dry or pre-mixed additive chems. For example, if I had a 20-gallon brute trash can with the saltwater that tested at 8 DKH alkalinity, but wanted to raise it to 10 DKH with the BRS sodium bicarbonate, I would put that info into the BRS calculator and find that I need to dose 57 mils of pre-mixed liquid or use 4.5 grams of dry sodium bicarb powder, and then repeat this procedure for the calcium and magnesium with some time in between to reduce precipitation. With that in mind, what can mixing the two Red Sea salts do differently than this approach? Well, I'd say that the main benefit I can see here, specifically if your levels are pretty close to being in the middle of the parameters that I mentioned earlier, is that there is some marginal benefit in time saved versus adjusting all three levels independently, with the reasonable expectation that the mixed batch parameters would fall somewhere in the middle. I wanted to test this theory for myself, in which case I mixed up a 5-gallon bucket of Red Sea Coral Pro and Blue Bucket salt mixes to 35 parts per thousand, and then tested their individual parameters, then mixed equal parts of each salt mix to test the same levels. As expected, the Blue Bucket mixed up to an alk of 8.3, calcium at 400, and mag at 1300, while the Coral Pro tested at 11.1 alk, 440 calcium, and 1400 for magnesium. Also, as could be expected, the 50-50 salt mix fell pretty close to right between the Red Sea mixes, with an alkalinity testing at 9.4 DKH, calcium at 410 parts per million, and magnesium at 1340. So all in all, understanding that these test kits aren't perfect and do have some margin of error, if I were aiming for levels like these, then mixing the two salts would be a viable option with a couple caveats to keep in mind. First, because salt mixes can potentially stratify during shipment where the various components can settle into layers within the bag or bucket, it's always best practice to mix each one thoroughly to blend the components together evenly before using them. Along with that, I would be sure to accurately measure each salt mix equally to ensure you get a solid 50-50 mix, which I definitely recommend doing by weight for larger volumes of water. Finally, with the cost per gallon difference from the 175-gallon buckets versus the smaller 55-gallon buckets being only 7 to 9 cents per gallon, I'd personally opt for the smaller size for the ease of storage and because it would likely be cheaper for me to find a storage solution around 100 gallons to mix both buckets entirely while at the same time taking up relatively smaller footprint in my home. Thanks for watching, and thank you, Robert Collins, for the great question. For those of you looking for a bit more, the best part about these are the actual experiences, knowledge, and comments that the YouTube reefing community shares on these topics as well. This conversation is where we get great questions for Ask BRStv episodes like these, so keep them coming, and we'll see you next time on Ask BRStv.